Greetings, everyone. This is Gunita from the 1947 Partition Archive. We're here for day 35 of the 75 Days of Partition series that you've been following with us. Today, we've got a very interesting guest. It's Dr. Deborah Nixon, and she's going to be talking about her father's story and also, the story of the Anglo Indians and domiciled British in India prior to partition and, their journey following partition. So I'm going to give you a bio here for Dr. Nixon. Pardon me for a second, I'm going to be reading from a screen. So Dr. Nixon currently works with the Academic Language and Learning team at University of Technology, Sydney. Her research focus is on the plight of domiciled communities up to and during the partition of India, taking into account studies of displacement, migration, memory, and the construction of narratives about this experience. Her work is interdisciplinary, drawing on theory and research practices from history, anthropology, and geography. So welcome, Dr. Nixon.
My pleasure.
I know that it's quite late over there in Sydney. It's, I believe, around 1 a.m.
Correct.
And thank you, really, for staying up so late and joining us. So I'd love to start this conversation about, your personal story. Your father, if I recall correctly, was in the British Army, and your family had been in India for quite a long time. Do you want to start with maybe your family history and how and when they arrived in India?
Sure. Well, as far as I know, my great-grandfather was born in Rajputana or Rajasthan in around 1857 or 1858, and I'm not sure where his parents came from. And my great-grandmother was born near Alwar in Haryana in about 1860, I think, but I'm also not sure where her parents came from. So my family were in India for about 100 years. So my father was born in Agra in 1925, and the rest of the family were born along the Great Indian Peninsula Railway line across the central Indian provinces in the 1920s and 1930s. So I do have a very strong family connection with India.
And that is so absolutely fascinating. So that's multiple generations.
Yeah, correct.
Years.
Oh, I was going to say, I think at least part of the family were Irish, and so the arrival of my great-grandparent, being born in Rajputana in the early or the mid-1850s kind of correlates with the impact that the famine was having on Irish populations at the time.
Right. The Irish famine.
Yeah, and it was a great driver for migration, and also that the British were sort of grinding the economy of Ireland a bit. So a bit of a misnomer is that most of the British in India were English, whereas most of the British or the Europeans in India that came from Great Britain were either Scottish or Irish.
That is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and there's a power dynamic there as well.
Absolutely. It was the British colonial system was classist amongst its own, and it was racist towards outsiders as well. So it had classism and racism operating at the same time. So people of, say, my family who had an indeterminate sort of background, who'd been in India generationally, who couldn't afford to send their kids back to the UK to kind of top up their Englishness, were a little bit suspect as well, because they spoke with a sort of an Anglo Indian accent. They spoke Hindi and Urdu and all the rest of it. So they were sort of a little bit in between, if you like. So Anglo Indians and domiciled Europeans in the census appeared in the same group together until about 1911. And then in, I think it was 1935, a formal definition of what constituted being an Anglo Indian was arrived at, and that distinguished the two communities. But still, people conflated domiciled Europeans and Anglo Indians, but they more or less worked in the same areas as well, in the civil services, telegraph and railways, most importantly.
Yeah. And what is the distinction exactly?
The distinction is according to your blood. And I really hate, making all these kind of racism, race-based distinctions, but that was the definition. An Anglo Indian, to be Anglo Indian, you needed to be born in India with a European or English father and an Indian mother. And to be domiciled European meant that you were born in India and, your family were living there generationally, but both parents were European, albeit the wrong class of European, if you like.
Very interesting. And then what was the dynamic between the English and the Irish and the Scottish historically?
In India?
In India and, maybe even back home and how that played in. I mean, I know a little bit about this, but I think it'd be great for our audience who may be unaware.
Okay. Well, as you know, I'm not completely over Irish history as much as I am just aware that many of the Irish were driven from Ireland to great waves of migration to the United States and to India for economic reasons, because of poverty, and because the British were actually crushing them. And the Scots were recruited into the army because the British had this notion about martial race theory. And the Scots were kind of identified as being very masculine and very aggressive. And once again, probably came to India more for economic purposes and to get employment in the army than anything else. And as a part of that sort of martial race theory, the Gurkhas were also recruited into the army from Nepal, as you know. So there was, and also the British thought that the Gurkhas were a little bit more neutral, if you like, because they came from outside India. So their loyalties, if there was any sort of insurrection, wouldn't be towards India, but more towards the British. So there was a kind of big mythology around the Gurkhas. I'm just introducing that idea because my father ended up joining a Gurkha regiment. It's a very famous one.
Really? Really?
Yeah, the first Gurkhas.
Wow. This is your father or your grandfather?
My grandfather wasn't in the armed forces. He was a railway man. So there were a long line of railway people.
Interesting. And where did they live as railway people?
Well, interestingly, when I said to my father, where did you live? He named about 10 different places. And he said, Bombay, Bhusawal, Jhansi, Jabalpur, Dama, Itasi, and there may be more. And I was going, what? So I looked on a map and I realized that all these towns that he referred to were strung along a railway line that went across central India. And it used to be the Great Indian Peninsula Railway Line, which was the first railway line built in India, starting from Mumbai. And my grandfather was actually born in Mumbai, in Kalyan, or near Mumbai. And he was with the Great Indian Peninsula Railway Line. And my great-grandfather ended up being a train driver. So that rather than being, sort of generationally one regiment in the army, they were generationally with one railway line in India. When the railway lines were built in India, they were built by private companies. So they were all different. And that's why there were differences in rail gauges and so on. So if you were a GIPR man, that's what your family was as well. So they lived along railway lines in railway colonies.
Fascinating. And then it became generational.
And then it became generational, yeah. Except
that's a number of lifetimes of dedication to the railway. That's incredible.
Yeah. It was for Anglo Indians and domiciled Europeans, it was actually a really good job to have because locomotive technology was as awe-inspiring as flying an airplane. And it revolutionized travel across India, not just for British, for transporting troops and things around, but local Indian people actually took trains to get to pilgrimage sites, because they thought, wow, I can get there in 5 days or 3 days rather than 2 weeks. So they facilitated internal travel, although traveling third class was pretty conditions were fairly rudimentary, but people did it. So railways were a massive a technological revolution in India.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, you had, a lot of kingdoms and these little cultures that had not really interacted with each other, but with the railway, they were suddenly coming into contact with each other.
Yes, absolutely right. It had so many different impacts, economic, I mean, mostly to the advantage of the British, but people took to it with alacrity. Like if you could travel somewhere and go and visit your relatives or go to a pilgrimage site, you could save time and money in the end, so you went away from home for too long. And that's the way it took off.
And it was also a means of uniting the subcontinent that had not been united prior to.
Yeah, correct. And it's really interesting to look at the map as well and to see if you can see a map that shows the sort of evolution of the railways. It goes out like a spider web across the entire continent, starting with the Great Indian Peninsula Railway Line, which was the first railway line in India. So
right.
we were there from the beginning, really. So the first railway line in India was laid down between, I think it was, maybe it was between Kalyan and Thane. It was very short, the first track that the train ran on, and then it just built up gradually. So,
and when was this?
Sorry?
What was the time period for that?
It was in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Yeah, I can't actually, to my horror, remember the specific date right at this moment, but it was quite early on. And photography was also introduced very, very early on in India as well and took off. Yeah.
Right. I've been to the photography museum in Gurgaon. It's actually a friend who runs that, and they have some of these incredible photos from the 1800s.
And if you didn't have a camera, you could go to a photo studio on Albadevi Road in Mumbai, and they were everywhere in all the towns. A lot of Parsis ran photographic studios as well. So
that's very, very interesting.
There was a lot of engagement with technology at different levels. People took to it really well, actually.
In India?
Yeah. If it facilitated, getting things done, then people were on to it. Mind you, the way people were segregated on the railways wasn't a brilliant sort of thing either, but it did change over time. Yeah.
Interesting. And then what about your father? So he was born when and where?
He was born in 1925 in Agra, which is now in Madhya Pradesh.
Uttar Pradesh.
Yeah. And well, he was the only one born there actually, because all the rest of them were born in Jabalpur or Jhansi. And so he was born there, and then at about the age of 8, I think, he was sent up to Mussoorie to school in St. George's, which was very much the thing that railway families did, because the families were on the move all the time along the railway track. So it was quite disruptive if you wanted to get your kid to school. And so he was one of 8 children, and there was a 9th child that was adopted into the family, which had an interesting sort of connection to the family. So this boy's parents, he had an English mother and an Indian father, which was unusual at that time. And his mother had gone back to the UK for a holiday, and when she returned to India, her husband had taken a second wife, and she just said, "No way," and went back and said, "You can keep the child as well." And this man was a friend of my grandfather, and he came to my grandfather and said, "I don't know what to do with this boy." And my grandfather said, "Just, we'll take him. We've already got 8. So he joined the family, this boy, and changed his name from Hussein Amin to Gordon Forbes, and went to school in Mussoorie with my father and all his brothers, and became a member of the family. So
that is so fascinating. I love these stories from the past on how adoptions took place and how, they were sort of holistic family decisions, and there wasn't, an authority overseeing.
No. And I think that's the other thing that these stories do, is they really destabilize that idea of the sort of complete segregation of communities. I think in the smaller railway communities that there were a lot more sort of transgressive social relations occurring than there would have been in the big cities, where you were much more directly under the purview of colonial control around social interactions and so on. And also, I think living in those smaller, more isolated colonies, you simply couldn't have survived if you didn't get along with your neighbours. And, you know, my grandmother was actually from the Isle of Dogs in London, and she had 8 children in India, and there's no way she would have been able to do housework and buy food and deal with markets and the language and everything. She hadn't had servants. So.
Right. And so what languages did your father speak?
He spoke Urdu and Hindi, and he had to learn Gurkhali in the army. And he was pretty good at language. He told me that his munshi said his language was really good. He never lost it, actually. He would speak Hindi sometimes, and his brother came out to visit him from the UK, and my mother said she heard my father and his brother singing children's nursery rhymes out while they were waiting for her to bring out the dinner together in Hindi, which was really a really lovely kind of image in my head of him reconnecting with his brother like that too.
Oh, wow. That's really neat. And then has he told you anything about, or had he told you anything about the relations that they had with sort of, you know, other local families who were not of domiciled British or Anglo Indian, like local families in their area in Uttar Pradesh?
Yeah, well, the thing is, for my father, he went to school very early. So he went from the age of 8. Like you'd never send a child away at such a young age, such a vulnerable age, actually, because there was a lot of violent physical abuse at these mountain schools that are quite romanticized. But my father said that, you know, physical punishment, quite severe physical punishment, was the norm at the school. So, and they were very isolated up in the mountains. They didn't have any sort of form of communication with their parents. So some pretty awful things happened to them. But at the same time, he did have all his brothers there, and apparently the Nixon brothers were quite a force to be reckoned with if one of them was in trouble. So he didn't actually, they didn't get a lot of home life or a lot of time to mix with local kids. He said when they were little, they used to play with the local kids. And once again, when I was doing my research, a lot of the work said there was this segregation between local kids and European kids. But I think for domiciled Europeans and Anglo Indians, there was a lot more mixing and playing with kids. And I know that my grandfather had local friends, because I found photographs of them in his album. And also he was very fond of a Goan doctor. And I said to my father, were they really good friends? And he goes, I don't know. My grandfather was a bit of a hypochondriac, so he was always going to visit this guy. And then when I spoke to my uncle said, no, they were really good friends. He said, my middle name is Costanzio, after this Goan doctor. So there were all sorts of little kinks in the relationships between people. Yeah.
And when did your father join the army?
He joined when he was probably about 19. And he was actually on his way to Europe, to the European theatre of war, when peace was declared. So he more or less turned around and came straight back to India and joined the Gurkhas when he came back to India. And then, of course, the big partition and independence news started to filter through. So he got caught up in that as a soldier escort. So we're sort of segueing into that part of the story. And he spent his last year in India pretty much dealing with what was going on as a response to the sort of the idea, the notion that independence was coming, and then with the violence that was triggered by partition. So I found one of his regimental newsletters, because he was very scrupulous about keeping all his army documents. So I've got these handwritten notes and regimental newsletters. And there was one in April 1947 that he kept, and it said that the message to the first Gurkhas was that no matter what happened, they would be carrying on in India until the 31st of December 1947. So at that point, they knew that independence was coming. So the idea was that they would stay there for the handing over process. And then, of course, you know, it was all accelerated, and the terrible violence broke out. My father recalls the evening that the night that partition was declared, the 14th, 15th of August, that night, he said they were sitting up. So the Gurkhas were all homed, the different regiments were homed across the Himalaya, if you like, and his home, or his canton, was in Dharamsala and McLeodganj, and or near McLeodganj. And he said the night that they declared the partition and independence and everything, he said he looked down over the Kangra Valley and the whole thing just went up in flames immediately.
Wow. In Kangra Valley.
Yes.
Wow.
That's what he was looking at. Yeah. So, and then they realized that they had a catastrophe happening. It was chilling, actually, to listen to him speak about it, because a feature of the young, and I say young because the soldiers that I spoke to that were soldier escorts were all, their ages ranged between 19, and my father was probably one of the older ones, because he, at the end of 1947, in November of 1947, he turned 22. So he was 21 at the beginning, 22 at the end, completely different person after that year as well. And then an ex-Gurkha officer I spoke to in the UK told me about what his responsibilities were, which I found just unbelievably intense. And I said to him, well, how old were you? And he said, I was 19. So they were very, very young.
Very impressionable age as well.
Sorry?
Very impressionable age as well.
Yes, yes. So it impacted on all of them in different ways. And I think my father was quite severely impacted by it, actually, because he'd grown up in India, and ironically, his family were a railway family. And then all of a sudden he found himself on trains that had once been considered, you know, safe, secure, on-time spaces. And then everything sort of reversed. During partition, they became incredibly dangerous places. Train carriages were often attacked, and they often found dead people on the trains when they arrived in stations. The Gurkhas didn't ride inside the trains, not for fear of being killed themselves, but for the fear that if they were killed, there'd be no one to look after the refugees on the train, or the displaced people. So they would sit on top of the trains and try and keep people safe. But he said it was completely chaotic, and the violence was not something they were anticipating.
Wow. And what was the train route that he worked on during that time?
Oh, okay. So he was, as I said, they were homed in what's now Himachal, so that at Dharamsala. So to put it crudely, their remit was to sort of drain the Muslims out of that area and transport them towards Pathankot, where they were going to be picked up by another regiment and taken on to Amritsar and Lahore. So his leg of the journey was all around up through Hamipur, a lot of places up around the sort of mountains.
Mm-hmm.
And then to bring everyone together and walk them from Dharamsala down to a place called Yol, and then from Yol to a railway siding called Nagrota, And then from Negrota, they took them on to Pathankot, where they were then handed over to another regiment and taken on to Amritsar, where it was a lot worse the closer people got to the border. It was very bad where my father was, but it was even worse near the border. And it was a terrible journey because you were sort of hit both ways. So if you were transporting Muslims through Hindu and Sikh territory, then you were liable to be attacked, and vice versa. So it wasn't so bad for him bringing Hindus back, but it was much worse going towards Pathankot, as far as I heard him telling me. And on the trains, they had anywhere between 3,000 and 9,500 people. On the trains he was on, there were small gauge trains, so they were also very slow. And he remembers that it was hot because it was August. And he said the old-fashioned trains had windows that came down to your waist, really, and you slid them up and down. And he said, we went in and we said to people, please close the windows because you're going to get hurt. And he said it was just too hot. People left the windows open and they were attacked through the windows.
Wow.
Yeah, it was pretty bad.
So what I'm finding really intriguing here also is that they were actually given orders to remove Muslim families. So there was some sort of like central decision making that happened, you know.
Oh no, sorry, it wasn't they weren't actively removing people. What I meant by that was that people who were wanting to go to Pakistan, and basically it was really only a yes situation.
Yeah. Right.
Sorry, I'm sorry if I gave that impression. No, they weren't actively going, you're Muslim, you got to come now. It was more like, that's what's happened. I mean, people just sort of took it upon themselves, it seems, or there was this animosity.
Mob violence as well that drove people
pushing
out.
people out. Yeah. But yes.
And so he rode on top of the trains as well, in addition to doing the escorting?
Yes, so they would walk them or take, because it went on for quite a long time. So they would either walk with people to pick up points. So you might be walking, but they weren't like the really big kafilas that were happening further down the track.
Right.
So they would either walk people or pack them into buses. But the main thing, the point was to get people to the train station at Negrota, so the little railway siding at Negrota, and then take them on from there. So it was really just about getting them together to start with and walking them down.
Fascinating. I mean, it's incredible that he experienced that at such a young age. Do you think it was mostly the young soldiers that did this, or that had to do this sort of work?
Yeah, in fact, I was talking to an historian in the UK about this, and I said, you know, all of the soldiers or the young, very young officers that I spoke to were between 19 and 22 or 23, the young soldiers that were left to do the escorts. And he said, yes, it was a feature at that time that they were very, very young. So I guess the commanding officer, the further ups, must have been the ones that were dealing with the sort of operations side of things. But the younger soldiers were the ones that really had to get in there and move people around and look after people. The young bloke that I spoke to that was 19 was taking people from Jalandhar to Amritsar, I think, and he had a shocking time. But he was the officer in charge, 19.
Wow. And what sort of impact do you think it left on these young officers?
Well, I think for my father, he just wanted to, the moment he could leave, he did. And I think he was highly traumatized when he left India. So, I mean, he was lucky in a sense that he could leave because he was sort of, his identity was as a domiciled European. So he was considered to be British when he got to Australia. Australia then had a white Australia policy, which was really pretty hideous. And so some Anglo Indians had trouble migrating, but my father didn't have any trouble because he had a British Indian passport. And he left in 1948, and then the remainder of his family didn't leave until 1949. I think they realised that perhaps that they'd have a better future if they went to UK. I think we spoke about this before. My grandfather spent one night in the UK and then got back on the ship and said, take me somewhere warm. So they ended up, my grandfather and my two aunts ended up in Florida. But my father was the only one to come to Australia, and because he met an Australian Gurkha actually in Bangalore, who had said to him, you know, when this is all over, you should come to Australia because there's a lot of opportunity there, and, you know, we can go hunting alligators and all this sort of stuff, and made it, you know, sound like a big boys' own adventure. And then when the time came, this Australian officer said, well, I don't think I'm going to go. I'm going to stay on with the Gurkhas. And he became a career soldier and then went on to Malaysia and Vietnam and so on. But my father arrived in Australia, did not know anybody.
Wow.
And had no money and was pretty traumatized, I think. I mean, he wasn't easy to grow up with either. So it did have an impact on them, I think.
Wow. And what about his brothers?
Well, they, one went to Africa, one went to America with his two sisters because he was very little. Mm-hmm. And I think the remainder went to the UK, including Gordon Forbes, the young boy whose parents were, you know, mixed race, I suppose, biracial. He was biracial, I suppose. Right. Yeah, so they all split up, and we only met my uncles. I've only met one of my uncles, actually.
And why did they not want to stay on?
I think for most people from that community and a lot of Anglo Indians, it was the same. They just saw that there may be a better opportunity for employment and so on outside India, because under colonial rule, for example, Anglo Indians were guaranteed work in the railways and the telegraph and the civil services and so on. But those conditions were lifted after the British left.
That is really interesting. I had never heard of that before.
Yes, that's why so many of them ended up in the railways.
Very, very interesting. And how did they decide where they were going to go next?
I think it was, you know, it was predicated if you hadn't left, so some of your relatives have left, it was predicated on where your family went. And so people did tend to go to parts of the Commonwealth, if you like. So quite a few Anglo Indians went to Canada, like a lot of Indians go to Canada as well. And they went to mostly Canada, the US, UK, and a really large number of people came to Australia. So there was a direct line ship from Bombay to Perth in Western Australia. And I said to my father, I was hoping for something really profound, you know, some profound observation when he arrived. And I said, what was your first impression when you got here? And he said, oh, white people carrying the luggage on the docks.
Oh, wow.
No. And eating hot and cold food together and actually having to do everything himself. So he was really, and it was like, anything else? That was it.
Yeah. That happens to Indians when they come to, Western countries today. They're like, oh, I have to cook for myself and I have to
Yes, yes,
do all these chores myself. That's
correct.
really interesting. So how was the integration for him once he came to Australia?
They didn't really talk about it much, but Australia was very, very racist in those days. And if you were an outsider, it was pretty obvious. And my father, did come across as an outsider in a sense. He was born in India. He looked European, if you like. In fact, my mother's sister was married to a Greek man, and they used to get around together a lot because they had this similar coloring and hair and all the rest of it. And my father had this accent, so they called him Nick as if he was Greek, and I don't think he denied that, So I didn't talk to him much about that because I felt it would be quite a sensitive issue for him to have to revisit if he'd had a really hard time when he first arrived, because he was already very sort of traumatized by everything that had happened. And, he'd seen some terrible things, including women, drowning in a well and all sorts of things, dead people on trains and all the rest of it. And so I didn't ask him too much about whether he'd felt any discrimination against himself when he arrived in Australia, but he went straight to a university as well. So he got a scholarship from the army to go to a university. So he studied geology. Instead of going hunting alligators, he ended up becoming a geologist, which was a really good job.
Yeah.
And then luckily he met my mother, and and I said to my mother, well, what was your first impression? And she said, oh, it's fascinated. He was so good looking and charming and had this wonderful accent, and he was, kind of exotic.
Yeah.
Exactly. I didn't want to use that word, but yes. So yes, that's what happened. She came from a farming family that were neighbours of the man that persuaded my father to come to Australia.
Oh, that's really interesting. Is that a coincidence or?
Well, sort of, because that man didn't actually come to Australia, but he knew my mother's cousin, and they'd come down to Perth from the farm to go to some sort of party or something, and that's how they met. So I got a lot of information from my mother about my father as well, about his character and all that sort of stuff, because it's really hard to do this kind of really in-depth research about a topic as sensitive as this with somebody you're so closely related to. So I had to be very careful about where I went with some of these questions, because what I found, and this was a characteristic of a lot of the elderly people I talked to about partition, and particularly people who'd been there, was that they stuck to a fairly practiced script about what they'd been through. And if they stuck to that script, I think it was a safer story to tell than to disrupt the narrative with, some of the more really violent things that people went through, although they would talk about those things, but I wouldn't ask them directly about them. I would let them tell me. And what I found, a feature of trauma is, and going through an extended period of trauma like that, is that people remember sort of these pinpoint isolated incidents of things that happened. So, my father would say, oh, these women, thought we were going to be attacking this village, and we were actually going there to make sure that they were okay, because we'd had a call out, but we had misinformation. When we got there, they weren't being attacked at all. There were no fighting men in the village, only old men and women and babies. And they were also terrified. They threw themselves into a really big jail, a big well, those village wells that are really big. And he said it was terrible. We couldn't pull them out, and they were exhausted, and they had to leave them because they got called to another place. And I said to him, well, do you remember where it was? Do you remember where you went afterwards? And he said, no, I can only remember how awful it was. And he felt responsible for that. And in fact, they were there to try and protect these people from being attacked. And they were mistaken for the attackers for frightening these women and old people. So they got some of the people out, but he said they were very tired. These, it's almost a motif of women sacrificing themselves in a well if they feel so terrified. They would rather that. So that was a really awful thing that happened.
That is very traumatizing, and for him to live with that guilt as well, and for those families to misunderstand at that time period.
Yes, it was. It was just such a confusing time, and these were isolated areas as well. So, how much news people had about things? I think it's really hard for us to imagine a time where people didn't know what was going on at all, except for word of mouth.
Right.
So there was a lot of misinformation flying around, and of course, there was malicious misinformation being fed to people as well about what was happening.
Right. We've heard about many stories like that of misinformation, misguiding people into booby traps and so on.
Yes, I mean it was all the soldiers that I talked to sheet the blame back to Mountbatten. They just said no, it was awful. The way they accelerated everything. People weren't prepared. There was panic everywhere. And this sort of veneer of control just melted in this terrible panic. And one other researcher who's done a lot of work on the military said that the Indian Army actually performed really well, considering the fact that a lot of the Indian Army at that time was constituted in the Punjab in particular with people that had been that were from the very areas where they were asking them to look after people that where the conflicts were. So he said, this is Marston. He said, the Indian Army, despite what a lot of what has been written about it, didn't fall apart. And so close to 1 million men had been demobilized after the Second World War.
Right.
And so there was a lot of militia around as well. There were people that could fire a gun, who could attack other people. But the actual people still working with the army showed enormous levels of constraint or restraint, control. So there were kindness as well. There was kindness as well going on between people. And but it wasn't a good time to be in India or in the army in India as well.
Yeah. Are there other, insights from your father that you would like to share about partition that you think are not as well known?
Well, I think for him, he expressed a surprise at the level of violence. He just said none of us were anticipating it was going to be like that. And I said, but you lived there, like your family had been there for so long. Didn't you know how people might behave when something like this happened? He said, nobody anticipated it. So that was something that really, really surprised him. And I think that the whole process of also having to act as an aid to the civil power rather than as a combatant. So acting as an aid to the civil power meant that the army had to respond to the needs of the civil authorities, if you like. So they weren't acting in a combat situation. They were acting in, as escorts. So they had to act with a level of restraint themselves. So everything they had to do during partition, in a sense, was contrary to what they were actually trained to do in some ways. And he didn't really. I mean, all the stories that he told me were the things that I pastiched together to get this picture of what was going on in that particular part of the world. And that wasn't the worst part of the world to be in. It was very close to where things got really horrible, closer to the border. But yeah, I learned all sorts of things. Like, I mean, I think the standout is just the youth of the soldiers, the fact that they traveled on the top of the train, which, I thought, oh, that seems a bit cowardly. Why weren't you in there with the people? And as he pointed out quite logically, if they got shot, then there wouldn't be anyone to look after the people inside the trains. And there weren't many.
Quite a vulnerable place to be on top, because you can get shot.
Correct. But I think more of the attacks they were putting up with were things like pikes being driven through windows and physical sort of attacks like that, rather than guns. But they were shot at, because he does say, he found a young woman. They cleared everyone off this train, and then there was still a young woman sitting on the train. And when he kind of lifted her to pat her, I suppose her face had been blown off. And he was really shocked. I mean, he was young. This woman, was a teenager girl, and she
was still alive.
She was dead, but she was sitting upright. So he was saying to her, you got to get off, and she wasn't moving. And so there's something really wrong with this. And he lifted her scarf up, and her face had been blown off, and she was dead. So yes, so like I said, there were these isolated kinds of pockets of violence that he described, but he couldn't tell me what happened in between, if you like. They were going somewhere, and then this happened. And then they just kept going because they couldn't stop. So, yes.
Wow. And what compelled you to look into this past?
Well, I met a visiting scholar at my university, and I went to a lecture that she gave, and she was talking about how her family had been evacuated from Lauper and had come into the Punjab on trains. And she was describing their train trip, and I introduced myself to her afterwards, and I said, oh, my father could have been a soldier escort on one of those trains. He was there during the partition. And she was really interested in that aspect of the story. And I said, well, I've also got a lot of military documents or little letters of command that he kept, and I brought them in and showed her these letters. Her name is Dr. Anjali Roy. She's from IIT Kharagpur. And when I showed her these letters and photographs, and I talked about my father's experience, she said, this is a story worth exploring. And so in my thesis research, I interviewed my father, and then I sort of triangulated his story by trying to find as many people still alive in his age group that could talk about their experiences. And I then put it into the context of what was happening in the last sort of 20 years of the colonial rule, if you like. And I looked at photographic practices. I looked at technologies of modernity. So I looked at photography, railways, and cartography. And of course, when I looked at cartography, I looked at the partition of India, and then I looked at what happened to trains, how trains were repurposed during the partition. So it all sort of came together like that. And he was very willing to share the stories with me within that sort of, within that context. But it was, it's always difficult doing research with family members. So it was slightly easier to work with people I wasn't related to. And he was a very strict father, so, you can't talk back or argue about anything. So I just said, yes, okay. But he was very generous.
Where can we find, if people want to read more about your research, is there a book or are there papers that you could guide them to?
I have written quite a few papers. I wrote a thesis, and I haven't written it into a book yet. But I can actually give you some to post on your
Sure, you post under this video.
Yeah. So I have, if you just Googled my name and partition and railways, lots of stuff will probably pop up. I even did a story for National Geographic India once on photography and railways.
Oh, amazing.
And I'll have a paper published by the Trans-Asia Photographic Journal, which is published out of Toronto, University of Toronto in Canada, around some of the photographs that my father took around the time of partition. So, and I have already sent you some of those photographs as well that show the soldiers sitting on top of the trams and what it looked like in the area they were in. So
if you have any on your desktop, you might be able to share on the screen here. Not sure if you're prepared for that.
I'm not.
That's okay. Maybe another time.
Yes, absolutely. I would very happily do a short podcast on photographs from India pre-partition, if that would be of interest to anyone.
Yeah, definitely. I think that would be really interesting.
Just pushing myself forward here, but I could easily do that. Or
okay, it's a plan. Let's do that. Let's do another short episode on photographs from that time period.
Yes, I've really got a good collection. He was so as I was saying right at the beginning, there was a real fascination with new technologies like photography, which had actually been around more or less the same time that it was emerging in Europe. It was the same in India, and there were all these photographic studios, and people went off and had these carte de visite made, these big cardboard photograph portraits of themselves. And but then when cameras became mobile, my father got really interested, and he took lots and lots of photographs of Dussehra, which is something the Gurkhas all did. The last Dussehra he went to, which was in November 1946. They didn't have one in 1947. And yes, lots of interesting photographs I can share with you at another stage.
I can't wait. That sounds amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think we may have to wrap up as we're nearing the end of the hour.
Yes, I'm sorry. I've probably taken up more time.
No apology. It was such a great learning experience for myself and our viewers. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I know it's probably 2 a.m. over there now.
It is nudging 2 a.m.
So I hope you'll get some sleep tonight. And I look forward to speaking to you again when we go through the photographs that you have.
Thank you, Gunita. It's been an absolute pleasure to share this very personal story to add to the archive.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. I think it's very educational.
Okay.